Welcome back to the DLOH, your mental health toolkit. I'm Danisha Abair, and today we're talking about something deeply personal yet universally experienced: grief. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, a relationship, or even a significant life change, grief touches all of us in different ways. Together, we'll explore what grief is, how it manifests, and how to navigate it with compassion and resilience. Grief is one of the most profound emotional experiences we face as humans. Grief is a natural response to loss, but it often is misunderstood, largely because it isn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It's complex, deeply personal, and often unpredictable. Grief is a reflection of love, connection, and the things that matter most to us. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or a major life transition, grief shows up in many forms. The renowned psychiatrist Elizabeth Kübler-Ross introduced the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's one of the most well-known frameworks for understanding the range of emotions we feel as we grieve a loss. We are going to cover each stage in detail, but before we do so, it is important to remember that these stages are not linear. Someone who is grieving may go through these stages in any order, and they may return to previous stages. This can look like them moving back and forth between stages, or they may skip certain stages altogether. Let's begin with denial. At this point, the reality of the loss may feel too overwhelming to accept, so the person might try to avoid acknowledging it. They may say things like, "This can't be happening," or "I don't believe this is real." They may even act as though everything is fine. They may avoid talking about the loss, or they may pretend that things are normal. For example, someone might continue to set a place for the person who has passed away as if they are still there. Next, we have anger. As the reality of the loss sets in, feelings of frustration and helplessness can often arise, often directed at the situation, others, or even oneself. They may say things like, "Why is this happening to me?" Or, "It's not fair." They may lash out at others, isolate themselves, or express frustration in unhealthy ways. An example might be someone who feels angry at themselves for not spending more time with a loved one before they passed. Bargaining is the stage where someone may try to make deals with a higher power or even themselves, hoping that if they act a certain way, they can reverse or lessen the pain of the loss. They may say things like, if only I had done things differently, or I'll be a better person if you bring them back. They may do things like reflect on past choices, obsess over what could have been, or try to make promises they can't keep. For example, someone might pray for the return of a loved one or promise to change certain behaviors in exchange for relief from their grief. The depression stage often involves feelings of deep sadness, despair, and hopelessness. It's when the person fully feels the weight of the loss and may begin to withdraw from life. They may say things like, I can't go on, or nothing will ever be the same. They may do things like spend time alone, lose interest in activities they once enjoyed, or have trouble getting out of bed. Someone in this stage might feel overwhelmed by the grief, saying things like, I feel like I'll never be happy again. Finally, we have acceptance. This doesn't mean that the person is okay with the loss, but they've come to terms with it. They've found a way to move forward, even though life will never be the same. They may say things like, I'm learning how to live with this, or I'll carry their memory with me. They may do things like engage in new activities, reconnect with loved ones, and even create a new sense of normalcy. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Once again, it's important to remember that these stages are not linear. Someone who is grieving may go through these stages in any order. They may move back and forth between the stages. They may return to a previous stage, or they may skip some stages altogether. It's important to recognize the different dimensions of grief. There's emotional symptoms of grief, which are feelings like sadness, anger, guilt, or even relief. There are physical symptoms of grief, like fatigue, body aches, or changes in a person's sleep or appetite. There are cognitive symptoms like difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, racing thoughts, or even memory issues. Memory loss is a common experience when one is experiencing grief. There may also be behavioral changes, like the individual may withdraw from others or make changes in their daily routines. So instead of going to the gym after work, they may skip the gym and go home and get in bed. Grief can arise from many experiences. We mentioned before, it could be a significant change in your life. It could be losing a loved one. It could be experiencing a breakup or divorce, even losing a job or one's sense of identity. And even positive changes like moving to a new city can bring grief as an individual lets go of what was. Whatever the source is, it's valid. And it's that individual's right to navigate it in their own way, because each person's grief is unique. There is no right way to grieve. What's important is to honor the feelings and give oneself the space to heal. Grief is not something we get over. It's something we learn to live with. And one visual that I love when discussing grief is a visual of a ball inside of a jar. So for the purpose of this podcast, I'm going to describe the grief visual. For this, I'm going to ask you to envision a tennis ball and also a wide mouth mason jar. We're going to be covering 3 different sizes in this visual. Imagine the tennis ball going inside of an 8-ounce wide mouth mason jar. One would be able to visualize the tennis ball taking up a significant amount of space within that mason jar. For this visual, the tennis ball represents grief, and the mason jar represents our experience with grief. Over time, that 8-ounce jar expands to a 16-ounce capacity. The tennis ball, representing grief, remains the same size, but there's a little bit more space in the jar. That extra space can be thought of as an individual adjusting to the loss. With more time, that mason jar capacity expands to 32 ounces, doubling in size. Again, the tennis ball, representing grief, remains the same size, still holding the same amount of significant space, but there is additional extra space. The extra space can be thought of as an individual adjusting to the loss and possibly coping with the loss. This is a visual representation of the way that grief is not something we get over. It's something we learn to live with. Let's talk about tools to help navigate grief. These aren't about fixing grief or even rushing through it, but rather supporting oneself through the process. The first tool is to allow oneself to feel. Grief often brings up emotions we'd rather avoid, but pushing those feelings away can make the healing process harder. Instead, give oneself permission to feel, whether it's sadness, anger, or even joy, in the memories you cherish. The second tool is to create rituals. Rituals can provide comfort and structure. This may be lighting a candle, praying, journaling, creating a memory box, or simply setting aside time to reflect on your loss. These acts may be difficult, they may be uncomfortable, but these acts can help one process one's emotions. The third tool is to lean on a support system. This is important because grief can feel isolating, but one does not have to go through grief alone. Reaching out to friends, family, or support groups can be helpful. Sometimes being heard and sharing your story can be incredibly healing. One organization that is nationwide that provides quality grief support groups is an organization called GriefShare, and you can find them by going to www.griefshare.org. There are groups all over the country happening both in person and online. If anyone that you may know would benefit from attending a support group specifically on grief, I would definitely refer them to GriefShare. There are also professionals that specialize in doing grief work. And that's my fourth tip: seeking professional help, especially if the grief feels overwhelming or unmanageable. Those are signs to consider speaking with a therapist. A therapist can provide guidance tailored to one's unique experience. I'd like to share an exercise that can assist you or a loved one process grief. It's called A Letter to Your Loss. Before we go further, if you're going to do this exercise, please do it in a stationary environment where you're able to safely concentrate. Now, take a moment to grab a pen and paper, or you can just imagine writing. Picture the person, the relationship, or the situation you've lost. In this exercise, you're going to write to them as if they were right in front of you. Start with, I miss you because. Then go to, I'm grateful for. And lastly, I wish I could tell you. There is no right or wrong way to do this. Let the words flow naturally. And if emotions come up, let them. This exercise is about creating space for your grief and giving it a voice. You can utilize this exercise anytime you need. It's an effective way to connect with your emotions and honor your loss. Grief can feel endless, but over time, it does evolve. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means we learn to carry it differently. For some, it can be a source of meaning or a catalyst for growth. For example, some turn to advocacy or volunteering in honor of their loved one. Others use creative outlets like writing or art to process their emotions. Even acts like sharing a story or supporting someone else can bring a sense of purpose. Grief can also simply deepen your empathy and appreciation for life. Whatever form it takes, finding meaning doesn't diminish your loss. It honors it. It's a way of saying, this mattered, and it always will. While grief is a deeply personal experience, it's important to remember that those who are grieving may need your support. Here are a few tips on how to be there for someone in their grief. The first is listening without judgment. Sometimes just being present and listening can mean the world. Next is respecting their process by not rushing the process. Grief literally takes time. There's no right timeline for healing. Many people get it wrong when they're trying to support someone through grief, and they get it wrong with this. Rushing someone to quote unquote get over their loss is not only disrespectful, it's unrealistic and unhelpful. The next supportive tip is to offer practical support. Things like helping with daily tasks, such as cooking, running errands, doing laundry, or even just checking in can make a difference. Grief can be disorienting, and it can turn someone's world upside down. And one of the most difficult things about grief is that one still has human responsibilities, such as paying bills, keeping the house clean, showing up for work, etc. Because of this, offering practical support can be extremely helpful. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Grief is a journey, and it's one that takes time, patience, and support. Remember, whether one leans on friends, family, support groups, or professional resources, there is help available. Being patient with yourself and others as they navigate this difficult journey is the most useful practice. Thank you for joining me today on the DLOH. If this episode resonated with you, I encourage you to share it with someone who might benefit. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And if you're watching on YouTube, click that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take care of yourself You're doing better than you think.
To say hello.